Now if this is held, it follows that God wills himself and other things by one act of his will, for every virtue is carried by one operation or one act into the object and into the formal aspect of the object, just as we see light and color with the same vision, which is made visible by the act of light. But when we will anything for the sake of the end only, that which is desired for the sake of the end takes the ratio of the willed from the end, and thus the end is compared to itself as the formal ratio is to the object, as light is to color. Therefore, when God wills all other things for his own sake, as for the sake of the end, as has been shown, he wills himself and other things by one act of will. Further, that which is perfectly known and desired is known and desired according to its whole power. Now the end of virtue is not only according to what is desirable in itself, but also according to what other things become desirable for its sake. He, therefore, who desires the end perfectly, desires it in both ways. But it is not to posit any act of God willing whereby he wills himself, and does not will himself perfectly, since there is nothing imperfect in him. Therefore, in every act by which God wills himself, he wills himself absolutely and others for his own sake. But another does not will from itself except insofar as it wills itself, as has been proved. It is left then that he wills himself and other things, not by another and another act of the will, but by one and the same. Still, as is clear from what has been said above, in the act of cognitive power, discourse is attended to, according to the fact that we independently know the principles, and from them we arrive at conclusions. For if we were to look at the conclusions in the principles themselves, knowing the principles themselves, there would be no discourse, just as it is not when we see something in a mirror. But just as principles are related to conclusions in the speculative, so ends are related to those things which are to the end in the operative and appetitive. For as we know conclusions by principles, so the appetite and operation of those which are to the end proceed from the end. If, therefore, a man wills the end, and the things which are to the end by himself, there will be some dispersal in his will. But this being in God is impossible. Since it is outside all motion, it therefore remains that at the same time, and by the same act of will, God wills himself and the other things. Again, since God always wills himself, if he wills himself in one act and another in another, the impossible will follow, for there are not two operations of one simple power at the same time. In addition, in every act of the willed is compared to the willing as the mover to the mover. If therefore there be any action of the divine will by which it wills other than itself, different from the will by which it wills itself, there will be something else in it moving the divine will. That is impossible. Further, it is God's will to be his own, as has been proved. But in God there is only one being. Therefore there is only one thing to be desired. Again, would it belong to God according to the fact that he is intelligent? Just as therefore he understands himself and others in one act, inasmuch as his essence is the model of all. Thus in one act he wills himself and others, inasmuch as his own goodness is the reason of all goodness.